Chip Cooper, founder of SaaS Marketer Pro, and also a full-time practicing SaaS attorney. Now, this is video number 1 regarding GDPR and the very significant impact of GDPR on US-based SaaS providers. Before we get into the detail, a quick housekeeping announcement. The presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, and no attorney-client relationship will be created. This is only a brief summary of the main points. First question, pretty significant. What is GDPR? Now, you can see from this slide that it is an acronym for the General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU, and it became effective way back in May of 2018. And it clearly is the biggest change in data protection for well over 20 years, and specifically for US-based SaaS providers, and even more specifically about how they use, store, and protect data, and not just any data. It would specifically be data or personal data of EU data subjects. Now, GDPR defines an EU data subject as any person residing in the EU, and of course, GDPR confers massive rights on EU data subjects regarding data privacy and data security. Now, before we get into the detail of the presentation, a quick discussion about the European perspective regarding privacy and data security, which is that privacy and data security are considered inalienable human rights, very similar to the way most Americans might, for example, view the right of free speech. And this, of course, is a central factor in their approach to legal regulation of privacy and data security. Now, there are a number of triggering events that led to GDPR, but one of them was the Snowden revelation bombshell back in 2013. And if you can remember back to that time, our National Security Agency, or NSA, was very busy collecting and even archiving personal information of just about everybody on the planet. And as you might imagine, this horrified the Europeans, and they determined that the U.S. privacy and data security laws and regulations were not adequate. And that term adequate is a term of art in GDPR. So we're not adequate for protecting EU data subjects. And as I just mentioned, this was one of the triggering events that gave rise to GDPR. Another question is, does it apply? Does GDPR actually apply to you? And the answer is yes, GDPR applies if your customer for your SaaS services actually collects and processes personal data from EU data subjects, typically because they're customers. And then finally, very significantly, if your customer transmits this personal data or some of it to you for processing, then of course you would be regulated by GDPR. Now, here's a quick summary of some of the main points of GDPR. At the very top, clearly very significant extraterritorial jurisdiction, meaning in essence that the GDPR regulations actually go with the data. So if the personal data of a data subject in Europe actually ends up in a company in the US, or even your company, for example, then the regulations follow that data and regulate the privacy and data security related to it. Penalties can be very, very high. If you apply the exchange rate, it could amount to somewhere around $25 million up to there, whichever is greater, $25 million US. And the definition of personal data has been expanded far beyond what most Americans view as personal information. And you can see there a very broad expansion, including genetic data, mental data, cultural, economic data, health data, and even social identity data. Now, the right to be forgotten, most of us have heard about it, And generally, it is the right of a data subject to request anyone who has possession of data to actually delete the personal data. And then finally, granular consent. Now, American businesses are generally accustomed to collecting contact information, which of course is personal data, and then using it for just about any purpose they desire, including, of course, marketing and advertising. And GDPR has put serious limitations on that because GDPR requires specific consent from a data subject for each specific processing activity. So this is a quick summary of what GDPR is all about. But for you, a SaaS provider, this diagram involving the personal flow of data really is where you are significantly impacted. And I'm going to trace the data in this diagram up, from the bottom up, every step of the way. So you see at the bottom, an EU data subject actually engages with a controller and essentially purchases products or services, and in the process exchanges the data subject's personal data in the transaction. And of course you see, first of all, the title controller is a term of art in GDPR. Essentially though, this controller who collected the data initially from the data subject is your customer. That's what is involved there. So far so good. Now we go up the chain and we see that the controller there is your customer for your SaaS services. And you see on the left side, you are now the processor in terms of providing these services to your customer. And of course, in the process, personal data, or some of it collected by the controller, will go upstream to you. And in the process there, the controller, your customer, has a very significant legal obligation involved in that transaction between you and your customer. And that is to impose upon you a data processing agreement which provides very significant restrictions on how you handle the data, specifically in terms of privacy and data security. Very important to understand, it is not your obligation to get the DPA back downstream. Instead, it is the controller, your customer's sole obligation to ensure that you are bound by this DPA. So far, so good. Now we get to the top of the data flow, and we see it gets very interesting here as far as you're concerned as a data processor. And you will be probably outsourcing certain services through contracts to what are known in GDPR terms as a sub-processor. You're a processor, your subcontractors are known as sub-processors. You might, for example, engage a contractor for website hosting or for CRM services such as Salesforce.com, or maybe email management. Any number of services you might outsource. And in the process, some of the personal data that has been passed along to you will in turn be passed from you to the sub-processor. And here is where it gets really serious. You now have a very significant legal obligation in terms of this contract with your sub-processor to provide a sub-processor DPA, data processing agreement. It's a little different from the one that was passed to you by your customer. If you fail to bind your sub-processor with these agreements, with a DPA specifically designed for this particular transaction, then you're in violation of GDPR and subject to fines. So this is really important that you understand this obligation. It is yours to pass along to your sub-processor. It's your obligation and yours alone. Question: do you need an attorney for GDPR compliance? And the answer, of course, is yes, you need an attorney. And the reason is GDPR compliance is really complex. There's a lot more to it than just the documents. There are a lot of regulations about how you go about your requirements for data security and privacy. Now, we all know that that's pretty complex and you need some guidance to get through the process. However, bottom line, SaaS Marketer Pro's documents will definitely get you started and will definitely save you a lot of time and some significant money. All right, 2 questions here as we get toward the conclusion of this presentation. On the left, how many documents are actually in SaaS Marketer Pro? The answer is somewhere over 75 total documents, each of which could help you manage your business and protect you from liability. I think more significant in terms of this presentation is the one on the right. Which documents are specifically for GDPR? Now here is a listing of the SaaS documents that you will have access to as a member of SaaS Marketer Pro. Starting at the top, 3 different types of SaaS agreements: enterprise, click-through, and hybrid. And these will help you find the type of agreement that best matches your customer. Going down, you see a data processing agreement, DPA, and this is exactly the type of DPA that we just discussed that you're responsible for in that data flow diagram. Service level agreement exhibit, data security exhibit, and then finally a data security policy. Now, if you look on the left side, you'll see 3 white checks under the GDPR heading, meaning that these documents are specifically designed for GDPR compliance. Now on the right side, you see not only are they designed for GDPR compliance, but they're also designed specifically for SaaS providers. So that's what we have for you with respect to your compliance with GDPR in SaaS Marketer Pro. Here we are at the last slide in this presentation, essentially a follow-up housekeeping announcement. Again, you're going to need an attorney, and if you're interested in discussing with me the possibility of entering into an attorney-client relationship for purposes of working with you regarding GDPR, all you need to do is email me, as you see there, for information at digicontracts@gmail.com.